everyone, welcome back to G&M Historians, where we break down big historical topics in ways that actually make sense. I'm Marcella.
And I'm Gabby, and today we're digging into one of the most misunderstood debates in American history, nonviolent protest versus militant activism during the Civil Rights Movement. But instead of starting in the 1950s, we're taking it all the way back to 1877, the end of Reconstruction.
Right, because what happened after 1877 basically set the stage for everything that activists, whether peaceful or militant, had to fight against in the 20th century. If we don't understand those roots, then we can't really understand people like Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and so many others.
Exactly. The goal for today is to compare how passive resistance and militant activism grew from the same historical conditions, but led to different strategies, goals, and outcomes. We'll talk about the overlaps, the conflicts, the shifts in ideology, and why the Civil Rights Movement was not one single movement, but actually a long continuum from Reconstruction to the 1970s.
We used primary sources like speeches from Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, and anti-lynching writings and government records. Plus, we relied on peer-reviewed journals and scholarly books for deeper analysis. We'll mention a few throughout, and the full annotated bibliography is at the end. 1877. How Reconstruction's end set the stage.
So let's start with 1877. When federal troops left the South, Black Americans basically lost the protections they had gained during Reconstruction. This meant the rise of Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, racial terrorism, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
Exactly. We're talking about literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, segregation everywhere, and lynching became a tool of racial control. Historian Eric Warner describes Reconstruction as a second founding, but after 1877, it collapsed almost overnight. Black communities suddenly had to figure out how to survive in a system designed to keep them powerless.
And that's where early activists come in. People like Frederick Douglass, who continued pushing for political activism and constitutional rights. Ida B. Wells, who took a militant truth-telling stance through investigative journalism against lynching. Booker T. Washington, who emphasized education, patience, and economic self-reliance. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who called for immediate civil rights and higher education for the talented 10th.
These differences weren't just personal opinions, they represented real debates about strategy. Should Black Americans focus on working within the system or challenge it head-on? Should the goal be gradual progress or immediately equality? These questions never really went away.
Right. In fact, these 19th century arguments literally foreshadow the same debates that would return in the 1950s and 60s. That's why historians refer to it as the long civil rights movement, because nothing started out of nowhere. The seeds were planted decades earlier after the fall of Reconstruction.
It's powerful to think about. The fight for justice wasn't just a single movement. It was a response to nearly a century of broken promises and consistent reinventions of resistance. Violent resistance, its roots and rises.
Now let's fast forward to the mid-20th century. A lot of people think nonviolence just came out of nowhere with Dr. King, but that's not true at all. It had deep historical roots.
Exactly. The ideas came from Christianity, the African American church tradition, and leaders like Howard Thurman and Bayard Rustin, who brought Gandhi's philosophy to the U.S. They believed moral pressure could expose injustice using peace as a way to create confrontation without hatred.
When we think of nonviolent protests, we usually picture sit-ins, marches, boycotts, and peaceful civil disobedience. But nonviolence wasn't passive. King described it as a powerful and just weapon, one that cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. The goal wasn't to avoid conflict, it was to reveal it.
And it worked. Nonviolence movements like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, and the March on Washington all built national sympathy. Television and newspapers played a huge role. Images of peaceful protesters being attacked shocked Americans across the country.
But it's also important to acknowledge the limits. Nonviolence required incredible discipline. It asked people to face beatings, jail, and sometimes death without fighting back. And it didn't always protect activists, especially in the Deep South, where police brutality and racist violence were extreme.
Exactly. Groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, started with peaceful methods, but as years went on, many members began questioning if nonviolence could really change systems built on violence. The frustration gave rise to new approaches later in the movement.
Still, the results were undeniable. Nonviolent action led directly to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two landmark laws that reshaped the nation. Those victories proved that moral and political pressure combined could make a change happen.
The rise of militancy and the Black nationalism.
Okay, let's talk about the other side, militant activism and Black nationalism. And of course, we have to start with Malcolm X.
Malcolm X wasn't against peace, he was against being defenseless. He argued that Black Americans had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. When you look at the violence and injustice Black communities endured for nearly a century, his message makes sense.
Exactly. Malcolm X criticized the idea that nonviolence worked everywhere. He said it's criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is a constant victim of brutal attacks. For communities facing police brutality, bombings, and daily threats, self-defense wasn't radical. It was survival.
Militant activism also meant more than just self-defense. It emphasized Black pride, economic independence, and global solidarity with anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia. It rejected the idea that Black people needed acceptance from white society to have value.
Groups like the Black Panther Party took those ideas and put them into action. They weren't just about protests. They built free breakfast programs, health clinics, and education centers. They wanted to empower communities and fill the gaps left by the government.
But like nonviolence, militancy had its challenges. The government, especially the FBI through COINTELPRO, viewed groups like the Panthers as threats. Leaders were monitored, infiltrated, and often arrested. Public fear of militancy also made it easier for politicians to discredit the movement.
Still, militant activism forced America to confront issues that polite debate avoided, like police brutality, poverty, and systemic racism. Without that pressure, those issues might have been ignored much longer.
So in a way, militancy made the country face uncomfortable truths. It demanded respect and equality, not pity or patience.
What ties both movements together?
Here's the most important thing. Nonviolence protests and militant activism were not enemies. They were two responses to the same long history of oppression that began after the Reconstruction.
Exactly. Both movements wanted the same things: dignity, safety, and justice. They just believed different methods would get them there. And most people supported both strategies at different times, depending on the movement.
The two movements also influenced each other more than people realize. The success of nonviolent activism encouraged militant groups to expand community programs. Meanwhile, the rise of militancy made political leaders take nonviolent leaders more seriously, because they feared what might come next.
It's almost like they worked together. Even if they didn't always agree, one created empathy, and the other demanded respect. Together, they moved the country forward.
And remember, it all traces back to 1877. When the government abandoned Black Americans after Reconstruction, the community had to create its own survival strategies. Some peaceful, some militant, all rooted in the same struggle for freedom. So in conclusion,
To wrap it up, the Civil Rights Movement wasn't just one movement. It was many movements, shaped over decades of persistence, sacrifice, and innovation, stretching all the way back to the end of Reconstruction.
nonviolent resistance built national empathy and achieved legal change. Militant activism built pride, self-defense, and local empowerment. Together, they reshaped America's moral and political landscape.
When we step back and look at the bigger picture, what's amazing is how both approaches, peaceful and militant, actually needed each other. Nonviolent protests opened the door for conversation and exposed the brutality of racism. But militant activism made it clear that if the system refused to change, the community would no longer wait quietly.
Exactly. Each approach filled in where the other couldn't. Without nonviolence, there wouldn't have been the same national sympathy that pushed Congress to act. But without militancy, there wouldn't have been the same urgency or sense of power within the Black communities themselves. They were two sides on the same coin, both essential to progress.
Another thing worth remembering is that both nonviolent and militant activists showed an incredible amount of courage. Whether it was students facing attack dogs in Birmingham or Black Panther members standing up to police intimidation, both were risking everything for freedom. Different methods, but still the same bravery.
There was one message to leave to our listeners with. It's this. History doesn't just live in the past. It lives in every choice we make to stand up, speak out, and do better than the generation before us.
It's a legacy of both nonviolence and militancy. The belief that freedom is worth the fight, no matter what the form that fight takes.
Thank you guys for listening to GNM Podcast. I'm Marcella.
And I'm Gabby. And remember, you can't understand the Civil Rights Movement without understanding the long fight that started in 1877 and still continues today.